having me. Thank you. Yeah, gosh, it's so funny to hear all of that. And I think kind of everything that's happened in my life so far, and then kind of tying that back into imposter syndrome, which I think we'll talk a lot about today. So it's nice to virtually meet all of you. Thank you so much for having me here today. Excited to talk with you about imposter syndrome. This is something we talk a lot about at Concurrency, where I work now. It's something I've experienced personally, and I'm guessing that many of you may have as well. So before we get started, I just wanted to again thank you all for having me. And just let you know that we are going to have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So if there are things that pop up, you're kind of, wondering about or just want to throw out there, please jot them down and feel free to ask at the end. So getting started here, we'll be talking about, again, imposter syndrome, some of those truths and some of those myths, but also wanting to leave you with some strategies. And so as we walk through today, feel free to take notes. Of course, you'll have the slides at the end, but let's get started. So imposter syndrome is actually quite common. So I have included 4 people here. Some of them you may recognize, maybe all of them. Things that they've said that are really related to imposter syndrome. So Mike Myers, you might remember him from some pretty funny movies and things like that. Saying, I still believe that at any time the no talent police will come and arrest me, which I think is pretty interesting, because I would consider him probably one of the most successful actors and comedians that we have in our time. So that was his statement. Maya Angelou saying, I have written 11 books, but each time I think, they're going to find out now. I've run a game on everybody and they're going to find me out. Right. And so Maya Angelou, again, someone who is a prominent figure, or has been a prominent figure in our world, experiencing a little bit of that imposter syndrome. Richard North Patterson is an author, saying the imposter syndrome, I know it well. Inside every self-assured professional every self-assured professional lives a frightened neurotic who prays that he can somehow succeed before his clients discover the fraud. It's the guilty secret that drives us all. And then lastly, Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, saying there are still days when I wake up feeling like a fraud, not sure I should be where I am, right? You may have had similar thoughts to this. I know that I have. And so my hope today is for us to really, take a look at what imposter syndrome is, defining it, talking a little bit about the types of imposter syndrome that might come up. Some different cognitive biases. This dates back to my training in clinical psychology prior to working in organizational settings. Imposter syndrome cycle, some of those truths and myths, as we discussed in the title here. Some tips for overcoming imposter syndrome, and then lastly, that Q&A. So that's the agenda for today's session. And again, if you do have questions at the end, I'm happy to take some time to answer them. So let's jump in and talk about defining imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome is really the internal experience of believing you are not as competent as others perceive you to be. So it's believing you are undeserving of your achievements and the high esteem in which you are, in fact, generally held. It's also feeling you are not as competent or intelligent as others might think, and that soon enough, people will discover the truth about you. I'm just curious, is this something people have experienced? Are you kind of taking a look at this and thinking, wow, yeah, this seems like something that that I've experienced? I'm seeing some thumbs up. Yeah, absolutely. I know I sure have. I'm feeling it honestly a little bit right now, because I'm noticing that my notes are not showing up on my screen. And so I'm kind of maybe going to have to wing it a little bit. So we'll figure that out as we go here. So we'll jump in then to the 5 types. So there are 5 different types of imposter syndrome. The perfectionist. So in the oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to find my Michael, can I take a second to look and see if I can find my notes somewhere?
Absolutely.
All right.
And
Does
even
anyone know how to do that? I don't know why it's not showing them on my screen, even though I can see them. Uh,
if you want to share that one with your notes,
yeah, let's do that. I'm so sorry. This is making me, I'm gonna stop sharing for a quick second, see if I can pull it up really quick. Um, okay, let's see here. Okay. Thank you for working with me here on this one. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, can you see the 5 types again?
yes.
Wonderful. Okay, we're back in the game here. Thank you so much. Okay, so jumping back into the 5 types. So we have the perfectionist, the superhero, the expert, the natural genius, and the soloist. So imposter syndrome really shows up in several different ways and can be dependent on the person or the individual themselves, can be dependent on the people around them, the situation that they're in, and the past experiences that they've had. So as you can see on the slide, kind of 5 different types. I'm sure we could add more at some point, but these are the ones that really, when we look at the research, have been identified as ones that show up most frequently. So we'll go through each one just briefly, giving you a little description of what they might look like. So the perfectionist is often described as never being satisfied and feeling like their work could always be better. So they really, people who are in this category tend to fixate on flaws or mistakes rather than focusing on the strengths that they possess. So this type of imposter syndrome can lead to significant self-pressure and potentially some anxiety. The superhero is characterized by individuals feeling inadequate and feeling compelled to push themselves to work as hard as possible, no matter the cost. I know I've been here before. I do it many, many days. So the superhero is just that, pushing yourselves no matter the cost. The expert are individuals who are always trying to learn more and tend not to be satisfied with their level of understanding. So experts tend to undervalue their own expertise, despite being highly skilled in their particular area. Natural geniuses, then, are often described as individuals who set excessively high or lofty goals for themselves and then experience some kind of internal distress when they don't succeed on their first try. And then lastly, the soloists. These are individuals who tend to be more individualistic. They kind of prefer to work alone, maybe rejecting others' assistance and really seeing asking for help as a sign of weakness or incompetence. So I will ask all of you, just, after hearing all of this, I am curious if there's one of these that you've experienced more frequently than others. And if you're comfortable sharing, I'd love to, if the chat is open for business, I'd love to see, which one of these really stands out to you most. I think I gave mine away, that I tend to kind of jump into that superhero category. But if you're comfortable, again, please add that to the chat so others can see that they're not alone. So when we look at the features of imposter syndrome, we are looking at, again, they show up in different ways and really dependent on the person. And so oh my gosh, my notes this is not working very well. None of my notes come with it. Here we go. Let's see. So the features of imposter syndrome, of course, this list that you see on the slide, it's not all encompassing. There are many features of imposter syndrome. And again, it's dependent on the person. So it can look a little bit different depending on who you are. But what you might notice, is that that a lot of these are things we talk about in our work on a pretty regular basis. I know that we do at my company, whether it's in a one-on-one with our human capital team or with a manager or whatever it might be. And imposter syndrome itself, I think it's important to specify that it's not a diagnosable mental health condition, right? So this isn't something we're looking at saying, oh, this is something we need to treat, but rather just kind of a feature of how we are as humans in our world, and kind of that interaction with our environments. But Some of the features do share commonalities with some mental health diagnoses, of course, like anxiety and depression, right? So I think it's just important for us to keep in mind that today our focus is really on this imposter syndrome, so that non-diagnosable attribute, not focusing on mental health overall. So the most commonly recognized feature, though, of imposter syndrome is related to self-doubt, or telling ourselves that we can't do something or may not be able to do something well. Again, I can tell you that this is something I've experienced several times. Even my 6-year-old has been known to use words like "I can't do it" or "I'm too afraid to try." So it can happen as adults, it can happen as kids. Just keeping in mind that it is a relatively common experience. So when we look at this, thinking about self-doubt and this idea of, I can't accomplish this task, I'd encourage all of you to really pause when you have these thoughts and take a moment to understand what's behind it. So oftentimes that initial thought that we have that gets kind of thrown out into the world, there's something more to it. And a lot of times we're moving so fast in our environment or in our work that we don't take the time to think about, what does this actually mean? So consider the pervasiveness of those thoughts. How often is it happening? How much is it impacting your daily functioning? And, are you able to get your work done, even though you are experiencing this self-doubt? The next one is an inability to realistically assess competence and skills. So this one is also relatively common. So you might stop before starting a task and question, am I good enough? Do I have the skill set that I need to attempt the task? You might start thinking, I can't do this because I've never done it before, right? But what we know is that learning comes from pushing those limits. Growth comes from pushing limits and really trying something new, so that this type of thinking, doesn't prevent you from growing in your skill set. The next is attributing skills to external factors. So this is something we'll be talking about more in our next slide, but is often related to downplaying your success. So you might be praised for doing something well and respond back with saying something like, yes, but it's only because I got lucky, right? I can say, as someone who's not fond of public recognition or praise, I can tell you I'm guilty of this one quite a bit, right? But it's important to just stop yourself after somebody praises you and just say, thank you, right? Not necessarily needing to qualify it. Next, we have berating your performance. So this is another feature that shows up when imposter syndrome is present. It's the idea that even though something went well, it could have been better. So while this idea in and of itself is not problematic, it does, there's a personal factor in that, right? Like, it impacts how you yourself kind of continue to perform. So, again, it's this is how we improve, right? We look at something we've accomplished and we say, yeah, that went okay, and how can I make it better next time, right? But when you tie your personal performance to it, that's when imposter syndrome starts to kick in. So it's helpful to just stop and question, why am I feeling the need to criticize myself in this moment? Can I celebrate the success that we just had, even though I know that I can probably improve it the next time around? Another feature is related to fear. So a fear that you'll not live up to expectations. So without challenging your thoughts around this, you leave yourself really vulnerable to not trying new things, not learning or growing, and the possibility of not progressing in your career. Overachieving is another one. It may seem out of place in this list. I know initially I thought, well, gosh, does that fit? But I'm sure we've all been known to work overtime or put in those extra hours, even when it isn't needed. So imposter syndrome has been found to be more common in high achievers and perfectionists. Therefore, the kind of that overachieving nature of imposter syndrome really seems to fit here. And lastly, sabotaging your own success. So negative self-talk such as many of the examples that you can see on the list above, can affect us as individuals as well as those around us in some pretty significantly damaging ways. So should we stay in this place of self-sabotage for too long, we really risk that our negative self-talk will lead to things like decreased motivation, feelings of helplessness, and a decreased ability to see opportunities in front of us and then really capitalize on those. So the question then becomes, how and why does this happen? And the reason and the answer is related to cognitive biases. So imposter syndrome and professional self-doubt, it tends to have more of an impact on those who care the most about doing a good job, as well as those who have worked on building greater self-awareness. So our brains are really powerful. I'm sure you all already know that. They have the potential as well to work in both good and not so great ways. So if we tap into the psychology behind imposter syndrome, we look to social psychology for the answer. So within the world of social psychology live things called cognitive biases. They're the heuristics that really shape our individual preferences, our decisions, and our judgments. So there are several versions of cognitive biases, but the two that have been found to be the most related to imposter syndrome are attribution bias and selective attention bias. So we'll briefly talk about what these are, and you can see in the graphic here on the bottom, gives you a little visual of what happens, particularly with the selective attention bias. But to start, we look at attribution bias, or what is otherwise known as cognitive attribution error. This means that one really believes that successes, individual successes, are due to external factors, such as luck or the support of others, while failures are due to internal factors such as incompetence or lack of skill. So this attribution error really means that people struggling with imposter syndrome don't accurately attribute their performance to their competence. So this often, again, shows up as, yes, but I got lucky responses when people try to reassure them that they're actually doing okay. So imposter syndrome also means that people don't apply this same attributional process to their failures. So rather than seeing these, at least in part due to external factors, they attribute the entire cause to something internal. Again, their own lack of confidence or competence rather. On the other hand, people tend to apply the opposite principle to others, which I find very interesting. So the success of others are often attributed to internal qualities and their competence. And their failures are due to external factors such as bad luck or systemic pressures. So with these double standards at play, it's almost impossible to feel good about yourself and your accomplishments when we're engaging in these cognitive biases. So the second is selective attention bias, and this is most prominent when we're experiencing imposter syndrome because our brains are focusing on the gaps in knowledge and the lack of skills that we believe, or the gap that we believe we possess. So we, start to compare ourselves to what we think others know, even though it's highly unlikely and inaccurate. And that's represented in the graphic there. So we lose sight of the expertise that we do have and make unfair and unrealistic comparisons. So the forever growing body of knowledge in technology and healthcare and in other growing fields like those, make selective attention very overwhelming, right? Because it's impossible for any of us to know everything all the time. And when we're experiencing imposter syndrome, that leads us to believe that we're failing. So, those experiencing imposter syndrome really, they focus on, what they don't know rather than what they do know. So again, that graphic on the screen is a really solid illustration of how this happens. The overlapping nature of what we all know makes us more effective as teams. The goal is not to know everything, right? But it's to leverage the knowledge of the people around us so that we can accomplish our tasks successfully together. So the imposter syndrome cycle, the phenomenon typically presents itself in a cyclical manner. So the imposter cycle describes the circular nature of imposter feelings. Begins when a task is assigned. At this point, the individual will have an emotional response. That might be feelings of anxiety, might be self-doubt, could be worry. And then the response, which is typically either over preparation or procrastination, depending on kind of who you are as a person and again what that task is. You might respond by over preparing or just kind of saying, "Hey, I'll wait until the last minute." So if one responded to the task with over preparation, the successful outcome will be seen as a result of hard work. If one result or responds by procrastination, it might be viewed as an outcome as a matter of luck, or due to luck. So in the imposter cycle, gaining success through hard work or luck is not interpreted as a matter of true personal ability. This means that it does not matter which mechanism we use to complete the task. Even if the outcome results in a positive response, the feedback given has no effect on one's perception of personal success. And this really leads us to discount positive feedback that we're receiving from others. Again, going back to that yes, but type situation. So this sequence of events serves as a reinforcement. It causes the cycle to remain in motion. And that's why it's so important for imposter syndrome, for all of us to really take a look and take the time to examine what's happening internally for us so that we can break the cycle, and prevent it from continuing to reinforce the negative self-talk that we have in our brains. So with every cycle, feelings of perceived fraudulence, increased self-doubt, depression, and anxiety begin to accumulate. And as the cycle continues, increased success leads to the intensification of a feeling like being a fraud. So this experience really causes us to remain kind of haunted, if you will, by our lack of perceived personal ability, believing that at any one point we can be exposed for who one thinks, or being exposed for, kind of not being what we say we are, which then again perpetuates that cycle and keeps it in motion. Okay, so identifying this. So again, we've talked about this. Imposter syndrome is relatively common. Studies estimate that at least 70% of people will experience at least one episode of the phenomenon in their lives. So there's several indicators, more than, of course, are represented on this slide, but that might suggest that you're experiencing imposter syndrome. So some of them include, agonizing over small mistakes in your work, like missing an email or spelling someone's name wrong. Might be attributing success to luck or external factors, as we've discussed. Being sensitive to constructive criticism or radically candid feedback. Fearing that someone will figure you out or see you as being phony, downplaying your expertise, and engaging in negative self-talk, self-doubt, or self-sabotage. So we're going to jump next into some different truths and myths. And we'll go through some of them. And then, of course, we'll talk about some different ways that you can tackle the imposter syndrome phenomenon. So the first one I have for you is that imposter syndrome is not real. I'm not sure if people can unmute themselves, but I'm curious if you can. What do you think? Do you think this is a truth or a myth?
I'd say it's a myth.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. It is a myth. Yeah. So one of the most common questions about imposter syndrome is, frankly, whether it's real or not, right? You're going to check out, if you look it up online, you'll see tons of blogs about let's dispel this myth about, imposter syndrome. And then you have people who say, yes, it's very real. So of course there's a lot of kind of contradictory viewpoints on it. However, research does say that it does exist. So I tend to lean into the data. Therefore, I would call this a myth. So as we've been discussing, imposter syndrome is very real. And, while it's not a medical diagnosis, it really does impact the way that we think, the way we feel about ourselves, and then, impacts how we behave. So imposter syndrome is not anyone's fault. And I think that's the most important, I would say one of the most important parts of this presentation today is, no one is at fault for experiencing imposter syndrome. Overcoming it and challenging the negative self-talk when it comes up is absolutely within our control. So for many of us, an early situation or experience likely planted a seed of self-doubt. And when we're triggered by different situations, it can bring up feelings of unworthiness or ineptitude and bring those to the forefront. So when we think about it, kind of in the organizational psychology as well as the clinical psychology world, we call this an origin story. For some people, it's really easy to identify. Other people, it's much harder. But if you do have some time and you're curious about, gosh, I wonder where this imposter syndrome comes from, I'd recommend just thinking back. What's the earliest memory that you have when you felt self-doubt? And how does that trigger you now that you're in an adult and you're in the working world? All right, let's do another one for you. So imposter syndrome can affect anyone. Truth or myth?
True.
True.
Yes, that's right. That is a truth. So again, originally imposter syndrome was identified primarily in women. The research in the 1970s was really focused on this group. However, we have come to identify that imposter syndrome can indeed affect anyone. So as more research is conducted, they're noticing that more and more men are identifying with this experience. In addition, there's been a lot of research about different diverse identities, and folks with more diverse identities tend to experience imposter syndrome at higher rates as well. All right, how about this one? Toxic workplaces are to blame for imposter syndrome. Truth or myth?
Myth. They could help.
Could I say both?
Can we say both? Yeah, myth,
Yeah.
but they could help.
I would say they definitely don't help. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So maybe they don't help, but as far as blame goes, I can see how you can pull it either way, but I would probably go more with a myth. And the reason I say this is, we know that toxic workplaces can absolutely be triggers for imposter syndrome, but they are not the origin of the feelings that are associated with it. So I would argue again that toxic environments absolutely should be changed, right? On occasion, that means changing jobs. However, those changes are not going to make the symptoms of imposter syndrome disappear immediately. So this again relates back to that cyclical nature of imposter syndrome that we talked about just a few minutes ago. So over time, we become accustomed to engaging in these behaviors and negative thinking patterns, and they become a habit for us. So we essentially train our brains to engage in these thoughts and behaviors, which then reinforces us to believe the thoughts as facts, even though they're not factual at all. So I can see how that one might be. I'm trying to trick you guys a little bit too here and make it fun. So yes, they're absolutely contributing to it, and maybe not the sole reason that imposter syndrome exists. Okay, how about imposter syndrome is common in STEM fields? Truth or myth?
Myth.
Myth. Okay. Anyone think truth?
Ooh, it's all over the place.
That's totally fair. All right. The answer is truth. So imposter syndrome has been shown to actually be more prevalent, again, in high achievers or people who work in high stress environments. So as is true for many STEM fields, the level of stress, the high intensity, frequent change leads to more frequent opportunities for triggers to occur. So I work in the technology field. I'm guessing some of you do as well. And we know that, technology is changing every single day, probably multiple times a day, right? And so there's plenty of opportunities for imposter syndrome to kind of shine its or I guess rear its ugly head, if, as you would say. So that means that imposter syndrome does, according to the research, tend to be more common in those who work in STEM fields. The places such as technology, academia, in research, healthcare, all of that. So I'd also argue that, many times those working in STEM fields tend to be referred to as experts, right? We've probably heard that term. They're an experts in Azure. They're an expert in Microsoft Dynamics, whatever it might be. This designation can have an impact on the experts themselves, particularly when things don't go as planned. So those who are, less skilled or earlier in their careers might be looking toward the experts for guidance and support, potentially leaving them to feel inadequate if they can't provide that support because of the constant change, thus introducing imposter syndrome in that moment. Okay. How about this one? People with imposter syndrome tend to apologize for small mistakes that they make.
I would say true.
Yeah.
True.
Yes, that is a truth. So imposter syndrome can lead people to apologize even for the smallest things. So it's true and something I struggle with on a daily basis. So, with every unnecessary apology you give, you really start to chip away at your own confidence. So apologies have become kind of a habitual way of communicating for many people, particularly women. And it's intimately linked to feelings of being an imposter. So imposter syndrome ensures that you never feel good enough, which can lead you to undervaluing yourself and just simply feeling like you don't belong. So yes, apologies. Of course, there's a time and a place for an apology, but accidentally bumping into somebody at the grocery store, probably not like the best time to go through this huge apology. But just keeping that in mind, if you forgot to send the email, you can say you're sorry, but I mean, yeah. So anyway, yes, people with imposter syndrome really do tend to apologize for small mistakes that they make. Okay, I have one more truth and myth for you all, which is people with imposter syndrome believe their supervisors underestimate them. Truth or myth?
I will go with myth.
Yeah, is a myth. So this is a myth, though. I was trying to trick you guys again. So it's a myth because generally people with imposter syndrome tend to believe their supervisors are actually overestimating their abilities and competence. So while it's, unlikely to be true, you probably are more than competent to do whatever it is your supervisor or manager is asking. It's still important for managers to keep that in mind. So when you have employees, if you are a manager or a supervisor, and you have employees who seem unsure or hesitant to try something that they're fully capable of doing, it's a good idea to just spend some time unpacking why they feel they're unable to do it. Work within that relationship that you've developed to establish kind of that foundation of trust, exploration, and growth. I really believe that, managers and leaders have this really unique opportunity to tap into the power that they just possess because of their title, to be able to say, hey, let me help you figure this out, and really work to break this cycle for people dealing with imposter syndrome. Okay, so we're going to jump next into some tips and tricks. I always want to make sure I leave the people I'm talking with some takeaways. So we're going to talk about overcoming imposter syndrome. And one of the ways you can do this is to befriend your imposter. I know it seems kind of backwards, like why would I want to, take on and kind of be friends with this part of me that doesn't feel super confident. But it's a strategy I really recommend rather than discounting it. So the irony of imposter syndrome is that it can actually help you become better at your job. And I know that seems backwards compared to everything we've talked about, but research has indicated that a moderate level of professional self-doubt can lead you to building stronger relationships and greater comfort with change, right? But this is really only possible, and I'm saying this because this is, of course, that qualifier. It's only possible when self-compassion is also present. So if you don't have that self-compassion, it's not probably going to help you. But when those two things come together, then it absolutely can help you become better at your job. So self-compassion really means being gentle, kind, and understanding with yourself. It means accepting that we're not perfect and understanding that there's potential for learning and growth in every mistake that we make. So in order to increase self-compassion, we have to practice forgiveness and stop punishing ourselves when we make mistakes, right? Like me not being able to get my notes up during this presentation. Embracing a growth mindset and viewing challenges as opportunities to grow. Expressing gratitude and appreciating what you have in the present moment, and being mindful and strive to always be in the moment and be aware of what is happening in the present without judgment and labeling. It also means remaining open to learning and change. This requires us to be responsive, open to feedback, and to reflect on errors and mistakes. So this is representative of again, building that growth mindset, which has a positive impact on being open to change and adopting an agile mindset. When experiencing self-doubt or imposter syndrome, it's also important to try and interpret the feelings as a motivating force rather than a limiting factor. So start by reframing your thoughts about nervousness or doubt and change them into reminders that there's always room to grow. So deliberately embracing experiences that trigger that self-doubt in you really helps all of us to challenge and improve our skill sets and kind of everything that comes along with it. The next is, try not to be the smartest person in the room. It really only gets in the way of growth and learning. So that means asking questions. One, because there's a good chance that other people have similar questions. And ironically, you'll actually appear more confident in your abilities and in your competence because you exhibit the courage to ask questions and show vulnerability. So I know that vulnerability is something that's highly uncomfortable for a lot of people, myself included. However, it is something that can really help you to grow, become more confident, and help the people around you to do the same. Next, we have lean into failure. Don't shy away from it. So explore why you're afraid of something or hesitant to try. If you find that it's because you're worried about failing, definitely say yes, right? Failure is not a bad thing. Failure is an opportunity for growth. So through the experience, you really will learn to grow personally and professionally. And last, we have accepting feedback. So accept feedback and remain aware of when times when you shut down. So assuming positive intent from the feedback giver is a great place to start. If you can internalize and really believe that feedback is typically provided because someone wants to see you get better and because they believe you can do something, you're much more likely to plan out how you'll apply that feedback and how it fits into your life. Ultimately, this gives you more control over what happens next for you. So another way for us to overcome imposter syndrome is to think about how we respond. And so the key to responding to imposter syndrome and professional self-doubt is really noticing our cognitive biases, that attribution bias and selective attention bias we spoke about earlier, both at work and at home, as well as cultivating that self-compassion. So the next time you notice that that imposter is sneaking into the picture, try one of the steps that we have here on the screen. So allowing thoughts and feelings to be present. So don't fight them, just let them be there, acknowledge their presence, and remember that acknowledgement does not equate to agreement. You don't have to agree with the thoughts, but you can let them be there in that moment. Next, we have pay attention to your thoughts. So are you identifying any thinking errors? Are you overestimating how much others know compared to you? Are you minimizing your contribution or magnifying your failures? A strategy I've used to kind of pay attention to those thoughts is called cognitive restructuring. So when thought patterns become disruptive or self-defeating, it's really important to interrupt what's happening kind of in your mind and then redirect them. So this works by, identifying those faulty thought patterns by challenging them with factual information. And engaging in what we call Socratic questioning. I'm guessing maybe you've heard that term before. I think it exists a lot more in the working world now than it ever has. But it really means asking yourself things like, is this thought based on emotion or is it based on facts? What evidence do I have that this thought is accurate or inaccurate? How could I test this belief? What's the worst that could happen? And if the worst does happen, how will I respond? And then what other ways could this thought be interpreted? So using that Socratic questioning method really helps you to, again, sit with those thoughts, allow them to be present, but also challenge them, because a lot of times, especially with imposter syndrome, they're not based on fact. Next would be to note your accomplishments. So in moments where you feel like you aren't good enough or you're not smart enough, reach for that tangible reminder of your success. This could be an email that you save in a special folder that recognizes you of your work. It could be a card from a family member telling you how much you mean to them. Really anything that helps you remember that you are accomplished. You are here in this moment right now because of everything you've done, right? And it means that you have succeeded. Next, we have, focusing on your own achievements and try not to compare yourself to others. So imposter, kind of turning imposter syndrome on its head, right? The whole idea of imposter syndrome is I'm not good enough and everyone else knows more than I do, right? So when you turn it on its head, you remember that smart, high achieving people most often deal with imposter syndrome. So the very fact that you recognize it in yourself says a lot about you. So let that be the motivation to continue pushing forward rather than letting the imposter syndrome stop you in your tracks. And if you notice when imposter syndrome starts to appear, take note of what those triggers are. So pay attention when these kind of feelings are coming up for you and you're starting to have some of that negative self-talk. Think about what's happening, what's causing this, what's going on in the environment around me. So really having this information in your back pocket can help you to anticipate when imposter syndrome might pop up again in the future, and ultimately helps you to reduce the effects or the ramifications of engaging in imposter thought patterns. So I did want to throw a slide in here too around how managers can help, because I know we've been focusing a lot on what does it feel like for us individually to experience imposter syndrome, but I recognize that I'm guessing some of you are also managers or have people that report to you, and if not, that's okay. If you're not a manager, there's also some great techniques to bring back to your manager and bring back to the leaders in your organizations to really help you get through some of those times when imposter syndrome creeps in. So some of the ways that managers can help are to establish clear expectations. So by having clear job expectations, metrics for success, and checkpoints on progress along the way, you're giving others a clear sense of how they're doing. My company, Concurrency, we use quarterly check-ins. Those are already established. But these are in addition to the regular one-on-one conversations that happen between our employees and managers on a regular basis. The reason we do this is because it helps us to have very clear expectations. It helps us to understand both the tasks that our employees are working on, as well as what are their motivations, what are their goals, what's important to them as employees, right? Knowing this information as a manager and a supervisor helps us to meet them where they're at, to ensure that they are able to progress in their career, to build their skill set, and to really get to where they want to go. So of course, I would recommend establishing clear expectations and setting up those checkpoints where you can focus on both the work and the personal experience of the employee. Next, we have, being present and building connections. So from day one, starting at a company, I, am a strong believer that it's important to set up a path for employees to build connections, as well as being present with them on the journey of kind of working, just within that environment. I actually think this is true for clients as well. So if you're, a client facing person, just really setting up those connections and building those relationships is going to help you to be much more successful. So one of the best ways to do this is to engage in, for employees, potentially in a formalized mentorship. So this is someone that they have the ability to talk to who is not their manager, right? Even if you have the best relationship with your manager in the world, it's still helpful to have someone else there that you can say, hey, I'm struggling with this, or I'm having these thoughts, help me work it out. Employee resource groups or groups of like-minded people are also helpful in building those connections. Next, we have establishing and clarifying norms. Let's see here where my notes are all gone. Kind of in our remote world, building those connections and that communicating with one another is absolutely changed, right? We really can't, walk across the hall and chat with somebody. So really sitting down with your team members to answer questions, to kind of clarify how are we going to communicate now, making sure that cadence of communication, the tools that you're going to use for communication, all of that is kind of figured out as a team can be incredibly important. Checking in with your employees frequently and not just focusing on the work or tasks assigned. I know we've already kind of talked about this, but I think the most important part with this one is learning about them personally, right? What do they value as people? How do they prefer to work? Are they people who are really data driven? Do they like to socialize with others? Are they more of a get it done kind of person, or do they really want to bring others along on the journey? So having an idea of what drives your employees can help you to better support them. One book that I'd recommend to all of you is called Radical Candor. It's by Kim Scott, and it's a really great resource. It really focuses on this idea of balancing caring personally about your employees, but also being able to challenge them directly and give them feedback in a direct manner. And the whole premise behind it is I'm giving you feedback because I care about you, right? Because I would like for you to grow and get everything that you need and everything that you're aiming for. Which leads us into sharing feedback often. When a team member is experiencing imposter syndrome, it can seem very scary to offer feedback to them, right? I've been the feedback giver, I've been the feedback receiver, and of course, it's very uncomfortable. However, I would say I think it's vital that feedback is provided, especially in those moments, because it helps team members to really get a sense of how they're doing. It helps bring them back to reality. So if you remember that graphic earlier in the presentation where, there was the imposter syndrome world and then there was the reality, by offering feedback, you're helping get them back to reality and saying, hey, you don't need to know everything. That's okay, right? So by regularly offering feedback, you just end up normalizing that experience for them and help ground them in the present moment and how they're actually doing in their role. And lastly, then we have supporting career growth. So the best way to combat imposter syndrome as a manager is to really engage with your team members' career interests and support their development. So show your employee that you believe in them, that you're invested in them growing, because this only reinforces that they actually are skilled, they're good at what they're doing, and that imposter syndrome is actually not that real. So the last thing I have for you, and we don't have to do it now, but when you get the deck, this is an active link for you. If you're curious and want to know whether imposter syndrome is something that is present in your life, you can definitely check it out. It's a pretty quick, like less than 10-minute free online test, if you will. It's definitely not like super backed by research or anything like that, but it can be a fun little thing to go through. It kind of categorizes, are you someone who deals with like severe imposter syndrome, moderate imposter syndrome, not really at all? What does that look like? But again, just remember that imposter syndrome is not a mental health diagnosis, right? It's something that you can absolutely work on improving. It's not based in fact. And it's something that a lot of us experience, the majority of us, in fact. So with that, I know we're about 10 minutes ahead of schedule here, but I did want to leave some time for Q&A and discussion. So I will open it up to all of you to, ask anything or make any comments that you have.
Dr. Fleming, this is Mike. I know I'd like to get that Radical Candor book. That sounds so interesting.
It is. It's very good. I actually have a copy of it on my desk right now. It's pretty cool. It's a good way to think about managing, as well as like as an individual contributor, what that looks like and how you can use Radical Candor both ways. So
Yeah.
strongly recommend. It's like Jeff has a hand up.
Hey there. Thank you for the presentation today. It's very helpful and a topic that I've definitely struggled with over the years. I work in a very high stress environment. There was in your true false area, there was the question about a toxic work environment. And I just wanted to share a comment about that is I really don't think that it's the toxic work environment that causes imposter syndrome, but I do think it is a reason why people stay in a toxic work culture and don't move on to a different employer. I for one, when I'm going through this imposter syndrome and it's not my friend, I really feel that I may be found out in the next position, or I may not find out I'm as talented or as good or as helpful as I like to think that I am in a lot of ways. So I just wanted to share that comment that I think that it's not toxic work culture that causes it, but it is a symptom of why you stay in it.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Jeff. That's, I appreciate it. And that's, I think, very true. I mean, if you think about just the essence, right, of imposter syndrome, that idea that I'm not good enough, I mean, how scary would it be, even if you're super, unhappy in your current position, like how scary would it be to take a chance to go somewhere else and not know about it, right? So that's a really good point. And thank you for sharing. What others has anyone else on the call experienced imposter syndrome before? Is anyone experiencing it today like I am?
This is Rob. I feel like, I guess a little bit going off of what Jeff was saying too. Just thinking like the more I've been now working off-site, being on conference calls, being on video where maybe there's not as many people on video, it lends to giving me, for some reason, more reason to not be sure that I'm actually doing what I'm doing, or that I'm as good as I think I am sometimes. Mm-hmm. Just without seeing people's faces or getting responses. I don't know if it's the same, but I feel like it can have an impact.
Absolutely. There's a lot of information we're not getting over video, right? We're not seeing how people are shifting in their seats, or if they're maintaining eye contact, or what's happening. So I would absolutely agree. I bet I've definitely been in situations like that as well, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Matt, I think I see all the hands.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just didn't want to interrupt anybody or speak over anybody. So on the last two comments, I definitely agree that it's really very easily self-reinforcing. It kind of snowballs itself, or I've experienced that in the past. I've stuck in a toxic work environment in the past because of it. I've moved on from then now, but it really is easy to as soon as you allow your mind to go to one thought. I know we weren't talking about mental health, but anxiety kind of works the same way. You can jump to catastrophication really easy, and this works in a really similar way. You can kind of self-reinforce a delusion almost, in a manner of speaking, or at least I've experienced it. But one of the questions I had to add was when you went over the types in the beginning of the
Yeah.
perfectionist and the superhero and so forth, and you asked us to state ours. Do types change throughout your life or your career, or is it kind of tied to personality, or can you be multiple types, or do you usually squarely fit into one? And is that information helpful to a person? Can I use knowing information about the type of imposter syndrome that I experience to help me identify it or to help me work through it?
That is a wonderful question, and a lot of great insights. So thank you. I would say, judging by what we know about personality as a whole, generally our personalities outside of imposter syndrome, our personalities are relatively developed by kind of early adulthood, mid 20s or so. However, we do change over time, right? We're impacted by different experiences and different environments that we're in. And all of that can definitely shift how you perceive things, kind of how you interact with your world. So in the same way, I would argue that the 5 types, that perfectionist, superhero, expert, natural genius, and soloist, can absolutely change. And so I think that I asked you all to kind of think about which one you experience most frequently, but that doesn't mean you wouldn't kind of go between all of them at any point in time. I'd also say too that the triggers for each of the types could be slightly different. So something that, kind of that soloist part, there may be a trigger where you decide to kind of pull inwards. I can say, as someone who tends to be a little bit more introverted, that is something that I do when I'm experiencing imposter syndrome. I just kind of say, okay, I'm going to take it all on myself. I'm going to do this as an individual, and I'm not going to reach out to others. It's in those moments that I have to say, wait, what's going on? This doesn't seem right. What's happening? So absolutely, I guess, long answer to say, yes, you can kind of fluctuate between those types, but those triggers might be a little bit different.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Dr. Fleming, we had a logistical question.
Of course.
Anne is interested in the link to the self-assess imposter link. Is that in your slide deck? I think you had it in there.
It is, yes. And I wonder if I stop sharing, maybe I can send it in the chat to all of you too.
Nice.
Although I know you're probably quite busy today with all of your things, but I will still send it to you so you can pull it up and see how that goes. Hopefully that will work. There's a lot of different ones out there, so this isn't the only one, but it's a quick one. I just didn't want to take too much of your time up, so. Yeah. Awesome.
Can a link be added for the presentation as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I should just be able to. Is it okay, Michael, if I just upload it? Does that sound okay?
I think
Yeah,
so.
you can go ahead.
And I know when you do send it to Paul Crosby, he'll be able to go in and put it into your session where we clicked on the link to join the session. Okay. And it'll not only have the feedback that we want everyone to do, but also it'll say
presentation. Perfect. Sounds
Yeah,
good. Well,
you.
I just sent it in the chat as well.
Oh,
so
sweet.
And honestly, if there are other questions that pop up after today and you want to talk a little bit more, always, feel free to reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to talk with you about it and just be here as a resource. I kind of like the phone a friend and building those networks. I think it's really important. So.
So do you work in this? Do you work in this field and as your own consulting company, or how does this work in context to day-to-day operations?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I work for a technology consulting company called Concurrency. And within that, I run our talent development department. and run an organizational development consulting practice. So yes, the answer is I am both an internal support for all of our consultants, but also a consultant myself, working with companies on, like performance management, kind of personality preferences. We do a lot with insights discovery, which is all around personality in the workplace, and kind of HR type stuff, and really just helping people and companies to be efficient and productive in their workforce. So I have a lot of interest in this area, and I can see, I'm guessing some of you are in technology. If I'm not sure, like probably many of you. And so kind of that combination of the people and the technology is where my skill set is most commonly used.
Okay.
Yeah. Although I have been known to create a pretty cool Power BI report in the past. So I'm not a technology developer, but I can do it at times. So.
Say, Elizabeth, thank you so much for posting that in the chat window. I have just started to upload that on the website right now. It'll be there in just a few seconds.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. And thanks for dealing with my lack of Zoom knowledge. And again, please feel free to connect. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to talk with you more about them.
Thank you for everything. Really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for being here too. Appreciate all of you. So thank you, Dr. Fleming.
Thank you.